All right, and we are live. This is the happy hour with me. I am Eileen Cook, and it is Wednesday morning, so it is the first Wednesday morning happy hour. So this is a new shiny thing for me to be on a Wednesday morning. So I will be interested in how that works, and if people have deep thoughts about that at all as we go along, that would be lovely. So we're going to hopefully accomplish a couple things today, although I'm always open if there are other questions that people have, we can always address that. But first up, we are going to address a new thing for me, which was a picture book blue pencil. So I'm going to be doing that for Bonnie Goldberg, who has no camera, which is why she's being particularly shy today. But she can see and hear us. So don't make faces at her because she can see you. So we are going to tackle a picture book blue pencil. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about nonverbals if we have some time in the day. So Bonnie, I don't know if you want to come on and just sort of say, this is a project you're working on in different formats. So if you can, if people don't know it, just give kind of the quick elevator pitch for this story.
So this is a, a picture book, historical fiction. So it is based on the truth, but it is still fiction. And it is a spin-off from one of the characters from a middle grade novel that I've written. And this is a relatively unknown sort of hero of the Renaissance and of the Jews. And so I wanted to create a picture book for a much younger audience to learn about her. Is that what you meant?
That's exactly what I meant. So thank you. So Bonnie, I will send this back to you. And so I've shared the screen so everyone can see my deep thoughts as we go along. And I put this huge big warning on the front of it. Is I am not a picture book expert by a long shot. I don't even have small kids. So I have bought picture books for other people and I have looked through some of the others. But I just want to kind of put that little warning out there. And as we go through, you're going to see I have kind of a deep thought. So I do like it starts with a little bit of dialogue. So it's got this, I've checked all the doors. Shh, her mom reminds her, and they celebrate the Sabbath with their doors locked, curtains shut, and voices low. So I kind of liked there was this interesting balance for me where it's a little bit scary, like not scary, but scary in terms of, we're going to check all the doors and there's some kind of secret. But there is also this nice thing. So there's like fluffy bread and candles. So it didn't feel scary, but yet there was kind of a little bit of a hint of, I guess, tension. Part of what I looked at is where there might be some places you could even trim things. So they lived in, Portugal. They were only allowed one religion. Even her Jewish name, Garcia, had to be kept a secret. I don't know if you need to mention what her name was beyond the gates. That was one of the questions that I had in terms of what details could potentially go. And that was one where I think it's important we know that she has a secret name, but I'm not sure the other. Then you're going to see I have a particular thought that I'm going to cycle back to. But there is a saying which I have heard before, which is every person is like a world. So if you save even one life, you've saved a whole world. So I think that is a particular neat sentiment, and I'm going to cycle back to that later. So then I'm just going to scroll along. And then what I felt like happened, and I think part of this is going to be, Bonnie, what your hope is with this project, is then I felt like this becomes a picture book that you would buy for someone who was Jewish, because it almost had a biblical story kind of feel to it. But I wasn't sure it would be a picture book that you would buy for someone who wasn't. So some of that's going to be, what do you want your audience to be? And I'm going to cycle back to that again, but we get a little bit of history. So then I just want to say that we've got a lot of stuff happening, and I think in a picture book, it might be big things. So Garcia wants to help him. They get married, then he dies. Then she's left with a daughter. Like, those are some pretty big, picture little kids. And again, this is me not knowing kids being like, well, what does it mean that he died? Where did he go? Like, if they're going to get stuck on certain details, and whether or not you want to just focus on Garcia did these things to help other people, and leaving out the fact that she was married, that her husband died, all those kinds of things, which almost could be, I think, their own book. So that is going to be something to consider. I put a note in, and just because I always like details, and so you're putting in pepper and cinnamon and certain things that I think are going to pop and those kinds of things. One thing that just made me laugh is when I first read this next line, but Garcia spent her riches to help secret Jews wherever she could. She hid them on her spice ships. I read that as spaceships initially, and I was like, wait, this story got way different than I remember it from when I'd seen it earlier. And then she's helping various people get to various homes when they're caught. She's sort of setting them free. And again, my only concern was, if it's being read as almost like a biblical story, like what I think of, we read Bible stories when I was young, that's one thing. But otherwise, I wondered if kids are going to be like, well, why do they have to pay them to get free? What's happening? And you may want to open up those discussions, but you may not. So then she basically finally gets, she doesn't have to hide anymore. And she starts getting back the treasures that the kids have that the Jewish people are going to want. So the various books and so forth. And then she actually sets up a land that can be basically a Jewish homeland. And that's what's going on. So I love all this story. And you'll see at the bottom, I'm like, but I feel like it read a little bit more like a Bible story. And one of my questions was about going all the way back up and having your same opening, having the line where Dad says, when you save a person, then you save the whole world. And then almost possibly having her go through that. So if I were to do this kind of thing, would that be saving the world? Yes, little Garcia, that's what it means to save the whole world. If I saved books that helped people learn, is that like saving the world? Yes, little Garcia. Like almost some repeats, because again, I think what you see a lot in picture books is kind of a going back and a repeating. So kind of almost staying with when she's young, and sort of having her just like, good night moon, good night trees, good night things, where it's like, so this is saving the world? Yes, little Garcia, this is saving the world. If I, put this plant in the ground and it grows and it makes fruit for people that feed them, is that saving the world? Yes, little Garcia, planting that thing makes this save the world. So that there's this kind of repeat around saving the world. And then at the end, you might have something like Garcia would go on to do all these things, saving the world over and over and over. So that was my biggest thought, is thinking about how to do that. Now, I haven't read some of the picture books that are out there now that are like a history of Ben Franklin or a history of, so I'm not sure how those picture books are covering someone's whole life. And I think that would be interesting to take a look at, or whether or not they drill down. So it's little George Washington, and we see him with the cherry tree, and that's just the setup of who he became. Does that make sense, Bonnie, or am I babbling? And you can say babbling.
I just wanted your feedback. So, I hear what you're saying. I don't really want to go the direction you're talking about, because if I do want to do is I want them to know her and who she is. So the saving the world is what she, is a concept in the book, but it's not the focus of the book.
Yeah.
It's just that's the Jewish belief, and that's where she would have gotten it from. And then it's really all the things that she did it's more like a girl power, and defying kings, and, just her determination and her selflessness, and just everything that she did as a young woman. So yeah, I don't think I want it to be little Garcia.
Yeah, then I may trim out some of the things in terms of that she got married, or that he died, or that even that she had a daughter, and just be like, when she grew up, these are some of the things that she's done. And I don't know, those of you who have kids, if you weigh in, like, would something like that be in a picture book?
I think it depends on the age of child, who your reader is. So I think for toddlers, what you're saying about is this saving the world and all that, that's perfect. If it was for maybe a 5-year-old, then it could be a picture, it could be like a storybook with pictures.
Yeah.
And it could even be as much as a 7-year-old. Like I'm thinking kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2 age. So then you can get more complex. And
this is definitely an older picture book. And one of the big difficulties with a picture book is being able to leave room for the illustrator to tell some of the story and the words to tell some of the story, but the words not telling the story that the illustrator was saying.
Yes.
I agree that you could skip the transition, the sort of how she got from being a child to being this heroic adult. Skip the marriage, babies, widowing part, but expand on the examples of her heroism in a more concrete way. In a more specific way. And then that gives the illustrator something more to work with, but it also anchors the reader in specific events rather than general ideas.
So like an example of a time she saved a particular person.
A particular person or some other particular thing, and then allow the child reader to extrapolate from that. But I think if you start with the generic, it doesn't have anything to stick to.
Well, I wonder,
sorry.
Go ahead, Janine.
Sorry, I was thinking you could even do it from the other a point of view of somebody she saved. So, like showing how they got on the spice ship and they did all the pieces to get to freedom and how they got to the land and what they were hearing along the way about this woman. Like you could do it from that perspective as well.
I think that's an interesting option as well. Yeah, to have it sort of be like that, because it's interesting that you mentioned that, Janine, because one of the things that popped for me is that idea of being smuggled on a spice ship was one of the really vivid ones that kind of popped. And so, as Marianne's talking about having sort of a specific example, like she took a family, she would hide them on her spice ship. And I recognize that you're having to do a little bit of creative string there, because there probably isn't a listing of like she saved one family with one son and one daughter and this kind of thing.
It's just the way you tell the story for a child. The other just idea that popped into my mind when Jean was talking is that you could tell the story from the perspective of her daughter and start by saying,
that's a good idea.
When I was little, my mama told me about when she was a little girl, blah, 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 intro, and then say, and then I watched her do this, this, and this as I was growing up, specific examples, but through the eyes of a child.
Yeah.
And even that's even be more powerful in a way, Marianne, because you're talking about showing a single parent being strong, even back in the day.
And through the perspective of a child. So that allows you to focus on the kinds of details or specific examples that might stick in a child's mind rather than, the overview. Yeah. Anyway,
yeah, I think there's a couple of different ways. I think what was missing for me in this piece, and again, I'm saying this as I struggle because I don't write pictures. There's a reason I write longer books. It's because I can't fit stuff into these tiny little spaces. Is I felt like we were missing some emotion or feeling with that. Like it felt like a telling of these are the things that she's done, which are hugely impressive and, obviously important and all of those things. But I wondered if someone was going to feel emotionally connected to those things. And so I think, a couple of these ideas are interesting, or picking one particular part of what she's doing and telling that story. And then at the very end, you do have sort of a summary where it's like, here's what you need to know about, the real thing, where I can see if someone, like if a teacher was reading this in a class, they might give some additional information with that kind of thing. Summary
paragraph from a historical,
Yeah, because we have that in here. And so this is something where I can see, this is something the teacher's reading or a parent is reading and is then kind of incorporating that into, here's an example of one of the things that she did. and why it was so important. Helpful or confusing, Bonnie?
No, this is really helpful. I mean, I've been having trouble going back into it because so these are some things I'll play with to try to get. I think that's what I'm worried about, is that there's not enough emotion connection.
Yeah.
So I think that I can play around with some of these ideas and see if I can get it in there somehow with that, because that's what I feel like is missing also.
And I would do some homework. I would go to the library and I would ask the librarian if she can point you towards any picture books about real life historical characters and how those were handled.
I've read so many of them. Like, I've read so many of them, which
Yeah.
is, which I did as research to do this, but it's just, they do tell the story from beginning to end. Like,
Okay.
so, but anyway, this is really important for me can you just tell me one more piece, and then I do have to leave, but when you said it seemed like for a Jewish audience, could you just unpack that a little for me, please?
Sure. So what I'm imagining is someone sort of sitting down and it's talking, like the focus is, which is not surprising, but the focus is on how she helped the Jewish people. So I can see someone who is either agnostic or whatever being like, well, then this isn't a story. Like, this isn't a story about she saving people who happen to be Jewish. This is a story about her connection to, in the same way, like, I don't know if someone who is Jewish would be like, I'm going to pick up this picture book about Christ and the founding of the Catholic Church. Or whether or not it would be like, well, that's not relevant to me, which isn't a misnomer, because I do think they're like, just because someone is talking about the Jewish faith doesn't mean that that isn't interesting to me, but it's in the same way that was like, well, here's a picture book about Jesus. I don't picture someone who's Jewish being like, I'm going to pick that up and have my kids have that. Whereas if it was a picture book, possibly about Jesus, but about the importance of love one another kind of thing, maybe you have a broader audience. At the moment, it read to me more like what I would consider, and I keep going back to it because I went through 12 years of Catholic school, so I had to go to Sunday school all the time. There would be these Bible stories, which would be these short things about, here's the story of Noah, here's the story of so-and-so, and we would read those. But it was clearly meant to be, for lack of a better term, religious education versus a story about a particular figure. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. I hear what you're saying. I guess I think of, the ones that you're pointing out are biblical, but this is history. It's not anything to do with being biblical. Just it happens to be about the Jews, but it's really about oppression, I guess. But that's fine. I mean, if that's how it comes off, that's good for me to know.
Well, and it might be then thinking about, and I'm not sure if other people had that. I know I skimmed through it really quickly. If people had that feeling where it might be more specific to people who are Jewish, but that was the sense. Yeah, the examples I gave are biblical stories. So I'm trying to think of something where if it was, so is she saving the people because they're Jewish or because they're Jewish? That's the same thing. Or because she's Jewish?
No, sorry. I was saying, is she saving these people because they're Jewish or because they're people?
Right. Yeah. And she's definitely saving people because they're Jewish. Like, these are people who are in hiding for their religion. And so she is saving her people and the books related to those people.
So would she save people who are in hiding for their religion if they were a Muslim? That's just my question, because I feel that, like, I agree. Like, if you want a wider audience, even just reading the first couple of pages that were presented here, it immediately came across to me as though this was specifically for Jewish people, and while that might be interesting to me, I might engage more if she were saving them because they're people.
Or if the story focus is, we should learn what she did and have that no matter what. And I guess that's where, when I had the sentiment around, if you save one person, you've saved the whole world. Like, to me, that's a sentiment that I I believe does come from the Jewish faith. I could be wrong, but I've heard it within that context before.
It's a Jewish thing.
It's a Jewish thing.
It's a Jewish thing. But I don't want to belabor this at all, and I think we could be done. But we read about Harriet Tubman, and the only people she saved were Black people, and we as white people read that. So I mean, I just put it out there. I don't care if it is just for a Jewish audience. It doesn't matter to me particularly.
I think, Connie, it's more, from my perspective, it's more about just making you care about the character themselves, and I agree with you. It doesn't matter whether they're just saving Jewish people. Like Schindler's List went viral, like it was huge, right?
Oh yeah.
And so it's more about.
But I think Schindler's List is a placeholder, and I guess that's the question and the challenge then. How does Garcia, in terms of saving who she saves, which is totally fine, teach me about what I should be doing, given that I won't be in that situation? So what can I learn from her that I might choose to save another group or a different thing? But in terms of Schindler's List is about standing up for what's right.
Yeah.
Right. And that is
about too, I think.
Yeah. So what is it that we can take from her story that is then about, like, how do I take what I could learn from Garcia and apply it to my life, whether I'm Jewish or not Jewish? That I think is what's missing. Yeah.
It's about really caring about the character in the story and really and knowing why it was important that they did what they did, right?
Yeah. So, versus it being, this is a piece of Jewish history. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It totally does.
Yeah.
Really, really helpful. And I hate to have to run, but I'm at work, and so.
Yeah, I know, that's why we squished you in first thing.
But I'll listen to the rest of it on the recording, and thank you, everybody. It was really helpful.
Okay.
Yay. So yeah, I think there's an interesting thing there around how do you make something universal? Because we're all telling a story that's a very specific thing, right? So we're all telling a story about this person is doing this, and we're wanting people to, we might be talking about aliens or, something like crazy, like a dragon, where obviously it's not, I was gonna say it's not gonna be read by dragons, but who knows? They may have libraries, I can't say. But we're trying to sort of set something up. And I think that was what's missing for this piece. And I'm gonna go back and look at it again because I'm now curious to think about how do you set that up? And going to give a tip of the hat to, I think Janine was the one who mentioned the idea of Schindler's List, which is, I think a lot of people, obviously it was a piece of historical, not fiction, but, the movilized, I just made that word up. It's a movilized version of that sort of story, done for dramatic purposes. But certainly the story was meant to resonate on an individual level, where I think we're asking ourselves, like, would I do that? Would I have the guts to do that? I think of the story of Anne Frank as being, kind of another story where, for a lot of us, we read that growing up, and, you had the moment about, like, what would I do if I was in that situation? And we're sort of captivated by this idea of having to grow up kind of behind the secret bookcase, and what would that be like, and those kinds of things. So I think whenever we're telling stories, we're trying to find that mix between specificity around a particular example and characters that feel real, and yet some type of universality where someone who is not a dragon or maybe not a woman is reading a character who is that, and yet reflecting and thinking about their own thing.
I would speculate that part of the way that you build sympathy for or generalize from that specific to your own situation is through empathy that you build for whoever is the victim that's being saved, but also through the stakes. So if the hero or the protagonist, whoever it is sacrificing something or putting something of their own at risk in order to step in some way, then that gives some kind of measure of value to the gesture.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
And there are hints of that in Bonnie's piece, right? Because we know what she's doing, but I'm not sure the stakes are quite there around, like, she did this at the risk of her own fortune and her own life, right? Like her decision to do that. And I wonder, And again, I don't read enough picture books, so I would have to go back and look to see, like, when someone's doing like a whole life like that, how many instances are they pulling out to kind of give, because I kind of really resonated with this idea that a few of you had of like drilling down, where it's like, we're going to tell one story about a family escaping on a, like, then for me, I was like, yes, that's what I want to see. But I do also respect that, you know, what Bonnie's trying to do is kind of show this full life examples. And it's like, okay, well then how do you, yeah, so I'd have to look to see. And again, I haven't, you know, read picture books in a really, really long time. And, you know, like, what are those, like, how are they sort of communicating those things to kind of get that universal truth, like, as Bonnie put in the chat window, that everyone's going to respond to. So it doesn't matter where you're from, that you're still going to have that kind of, hopefully, an emotional connection. Natasha?
With it's been a long time for me with picture books as well, but I kind of get the impression that a lot of times there's a balance, and I don't know where Bonnie's getting her images from, but a lot of times there's a balance between the words and the picture, so that sometimes not everything is actually illustrated in the words. It's also in the picture, so it can be a point of discussion for the parent to point it out, or for the child to discover it themselves. Pardon me?
Ask questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Something specific in the image. Yeah.
So,
and I think that's an interesting thing. I do know in general, again, while this is not my particular area, if people are interested in picture books, that with very rare exceptions, you're not expected to be doing the illustrations or to be providing illustrations. You provide what they'll call a picture book dummy, which is just the words, and they're then hiring an illustrator who is doing kind of that next piece of that. But I do think, even though you're not, and in my case, no one would want me to be the illustrator for particular, all sorts of good reasons, I do think it's interesting to think about, what would the pictures look like? What would, and I think you raised actually a great point, Natasha, like, is there something that the picture could be telling that would tell more of the story? Yeah. What would be on there? So it's not just an exact repeat of, I'm telling a story about this, and then I'm telling George Washington the cherry tree, so here's the picture of George and the cherry tree, and then he's chopping it down. Natasha?
Yeah, I wonder if, I just had a thought, I wonder if there's a bit of a correlation between writing a script and writing a children's picture book. Because with a script, you've just got the very basics, a very minimal amount of setting and direction and so on. And so much is brought from like a huge, you know, the rest of the talent on the production.
And I think that's one of the hardest things about doing any kind of screenwriting, if you're trying to make the shift one way or the other. But I did adapt one of mine, and it was one of the hardest things, is because I wanted to put in there, like, she looks down at this point, like, this is what happened.
Control anymore.
Yeah. And I'm like, but it's mine, right? So it was that very hard thing about trying to tell a story with words that the other people could then pick up and kind of take from there. So I think that is an interesting thing around, if you're creating a picture book, you know, what is that going to look like? And I think it was Kathy who raised the point of, even within picture books, you're going to see a wide range of what's in there, because picture books are existing for kids from kind of that toddler, look at bunny, like, to, you know, picture books that are going to go up to, you know, where kids are starting those kind of very early readers. Bonnie in the corner, for me in the corner.
I'm in the middle for me.
Yeah.
Of course, it's been a while since I've read picture books, but I've always found that they have one message. And I think maybe in Bonnie's, there was two messages. One was about saving one person, you save the world. And the other was, this is a fabulous woman who has done wonderful things. And she might be a little confused on what message she wants to input. So I think she's really proud of this woman and would like to showcase her. And that does come across, but it's conflicting with the other message. But I always found with the picture books I read to my kids that there was some message, whether it's, you know, grief will be overcome, or your parents will love you, or the bunny will
go
survive,
to sleep.
or, you know, there is one message. And I think with picture books, they have to be a little bit leaner in that. You're not getting subplots. You're not getting lots of discussion. It's usually very focused.
Well, and it's similar, again, you know, kind of extrapolating for people who aren't writing picture books or whatever, but it's this kind of same idea if you're writing a novel, how much you can get to and explore, versus if you're writing a novella, what you can do, versus if you're writing a short story. And, you know, I think for a lot of writers, there's this belief like, oh, I have to write so many short stories and then I will graduate to writing novels. And that's not actually true. And I think there are some people who write in all forms really particularly well. But I know for myself, like I really struggle with short stories because so if I struggle with a short story, you can imagine how hard it is for me to try and concept around the idea of a picture book. Like there's even less space to do anything in. I have a really hard time doing that kind of containment around, you know, like a short story is often kind of one moment in someone's life. And that's all that it is. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't short stories that go over a bigger span of time, but oftentimes when you read them, you'll see they're because there just isn't room and space to give context to those bigger things. I mean, I even struggle with novellas. And yet other people, it's the exact opposite. Like for Crystal, she talks about she's so comfortable in that novella stage and process. And, you know, for her, she's now looking at doing some full-length projects. And I'd be thinking like, oh, beautiful, glory, hallelujah, we got all this extra space. But for her, it's that thing around, okay, now what is she adding and how does she weave those things in so that she has that bigger, richer thing? So I think that's a really good point, Bonnie. Like if you're doing a picture book and having, you know, had the opportunity, like I've read some of Bonnie's work at sort of the middle grade. She was doing a middle grade piece on this where I felt like there was a lot more room for this story. And I felt like it was spreading out and feeling really substantive. And this one, yeah, for me, I think it did feel maybe either too compressed or there was something, and I think it was around that emotionality because there was so much to cover in such a short amount of time, like how to have that immediate reaction. And I don't know if that's something, you know, Marianne's idea about telling it from her daughter's point of view, or, you know, looking at how that's worked in other books. So I think there's some interesting stuff. Kathy, did you have a thought? Oh, you're muted. There you are.
There. Maybe she could write 2 books. I think you both have excellent points, and Bonnie especially. The idea that save one person or one thing and you save the whole world, you save a plant, you save the whole world, is universal.
Yeah.
And could be applied to the very young toddler. And then the toddlers that grew up loving that story could get into early readers and read about this magical woman.
Yeah. And she really is like, this is a person I had never heard of until Bonnie had sort of, which is the best thing about books is you're sometimes introduced to people where you're like, holy cow. So yeah, that is, poor Bonnie, she's going to listen to this later. We're going to be like, we came up with a whole another book for you to write. So just when you thought you were almost done. But I do think that is an interesting thing around asking yourself, when you have a big thing, like what is the story I'm trying to tell? And it might be that there are multiple stories within that. Natasha.
I just wanted to apologize to Bonnie, even though she's not here, because I totally missed the boat that this was a real person and she did real things. So all of my questions about different people saving them and all that was completely irrelevant.
Well, but I don't know if it is, because I think there's sometimes like when we talk about, for example, and again, this is not going to be a pictures book, a Schindler's List kind of thing, is, you know, what makes that story resonate is often like when you watch the movies, it's particular characters. So we see, you know, is it Ben Kingsley, who's, you know, his kind of second in command, and we're attached to him and the decisions. So it is made specific. And I do know that that's fairly universal. So when you look at something like the evening news, and they're going to talk about the California wildfires, and they'll do a big picture thing like this is what's happening, blah, blah, blah. But they'll often then hone right in and be like, now we're going to interview Eileen. Like, Eileen, how does it feel to lose your home and everything in it, right? Yeah. And then there's one person talking about that, or we see the dog who is rescued and, you know, they're, you know, now reunited with their one pet. And that is the stand-in for us to have this emotional reaction.
Journalists do that for a reason, because it's too easy to dismiss the big generic people that are whatever suffering on the other side of the world. We don't connect emotionally in the way we do with an individual. Yeah.
And if there is a large thing, it's almost too much to take in. And that's why you'll see, like, under some of the charitable programs where it's like you're adopting a particular person and you're going to get a letter from your child, and you're like, that's all around you feeling like, I have saved this one life and therefore it makes a difference.
Yeah.
It is the same thing. I'm a regular donator to the SPCA, right? And they're not dumb. One, they got my number. Like, they send me one picture of a like injured puppy and I'm like, take more money. Like, but it works really well for me because they send out these missives where it's like, this is Spot, who was found in, you know, these horrible living conditions and blah, blah, blah. To help Spot and dogs like him who need medical care before they can go out for adoption, please click here. And I will be like, oh, Spot, right? I'll click here. I can't even watch the ads where it's like, what's her name? Sarah McLachlan singing in the background. Like, I'm a sucker for that. But they pick the individual cases and they're holding up a particular puppy. They're holding up a particular
That's the way we're wired.
Yeah.
Can't do anything about that.
So I think when we're telling our own stories is thinking about what's going to be that connection. What's that way in for someone else? But I'm also respectful of the fact that Bonnie was wanting to tell a story where it's like, here's a historical figure that you should know about. And that's also a very different piece of that pie.
My idea about telling the story from the daughter's point of view achieves both of those things, because you can convey the magnitude of Gracia's life and all of her accomplishments, but infuse it with pride and admiration, which I think Bonnie feels for her subject. Yeah. But, you know, through this one lens, the daughter who has the pride and the admiration for her mother's accomplishments. And anyway, it's just one way of kind of achieving that big picture, but with the emotional connection.
And of course, because we're writers, like, I'm instantly like, I would find it fascinating to do an adult novel from the daughter's point of view around if you have a parent that does these. Yeah. So Bonnie, here's your next book. So you've done your picture book, your early reader, your middle grade book, your YA, and now I'm going to do your adult novel, where I would be fascinated to know if your mother is this kind of person where she is like, at what cost did that come to you as a personal child? Like, did you feel that, you know, there were certain things you couldn't have, or that you didn't always have your mother's attention? Like, I wonder if there's that push-pull that you would have where you'd have this huge admiration for what your parent has accomplished, but that came at a cost, right? Like, and how did that play out? And so for me, I'm like, ooh, like, there's your next story that you're going to be working on, which I think is, for all of us, that interesting idea of one of the very first things that we do when we're deciding to tell a story is choose what lens and how big we're going to take that in or out. And that's why one of the interesting prompts I've seen people do is they'll say, you're going to write a story about two sisters fighting over the attention of parents. And you can have that same story idea and you will have 12 people take that story so different in tone, in feel, in all of those kinds of things. We could lay out any historical figure, whether it's Garcia or whether that is, you know, another character, Harriet Tubman or someone else, and being like, how do you want to tell that story? And people are going to have such different perspectives on how to do it. So really the very first thing is that acknowledgement of, you're not going to be able to do all things. So what is the piece? And it's going to be different for different people, in the same way where I was like, oh, I'm interested in the daughter because I'm interested in mother-daughter relationships. And I'm interested in that when you don't always do the right thing and how that feels. So that's my personal bent that may be remotely not at all interesting to Bonnie to talk about. She might want to write a very straight historical. You could do a historical novel that would be this woman's life as an adult novel, which would also be fascinating to sort of hear and read about, I think. Guys, thank you, Natasha. So I'll just keep saying it wrong. People must laugh at me because I can't get you guys' names right. Like, Natasha, you're lucky I don't call you Nat. Like, I am the worst person with pronouncing names. Any other questions on that or thoughts on that anybody wanted to share? We have a few minutes, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about nonverbals, just because I think it's sort of important, and we've talked about it at least in some parameters ways, but I think there's some interesting things, and I might put some prompts for people to think about down the road. But obviously, nonverbal communication is any of those things outside of the spoken word. So it's things like your body language, your facial gestures, your eye contact. Sometimes it's tone or sort of like how you're actually speaking those words. So you can be like, I love you. Or you can be like, I love you, right? And those have very different feelings and connotations depending on how you do it. So pitch and tone. So thinking about how you're putting that on the page lets you either intrigue the reader. So if I say something like, Natasha, I love you, Eileen said, twisting her hands in her lap. Like the reader's going to be like, well, there's something else going on there, right? Versus if I'm like, Natasha, I love you, she said, softly touching Natasha's shoulder. Like those have very different feels, and the reader's sometimes going to be like, well, wait a minute, that body language maybe didn't quite match with what the person said. There's maybe something else going on there. And again, the character themselves may not even be aware of what they're putting out there. So this is a call to think about that kind of body language and what you have the character doing or the tone of voice that they're using in addition to what's happening with the dialogue. So not just what they're saying, but what they're not saying. Now I'm going to do a call out that it is important to remember that this is sometimes a cultural thing. So to keep in mind that we have very different perspectives sometimes culturally about what makes sense and what doesn't. Like body language space, about what's acceptable. So eye contact, for example, in Western culture is very considered of being sort of honest and open. And if someone's not meeting your eyes, that can feel sort of shifty or that they're trying to hide something from you. But in other cultures, direct eye contact is actually fairly offensive. So kind of knowing that those things might be different. Physical space, so how close you stand to someone. So again, in sort of Western culture, we have this idea that like, you got to give me just a little bit of room here. And other cultures, like it's quite normal to be kind of really up and close to someone. And that wouldn't be considered weird. Whereas I would find that aggressive or certainly very disconcerting. And I've had those instances where people are really, really close, and it's like not so okay with that. Even affection levels, which is not necessarily always cultural, although it can be cultural. So again, in France, you've met someone once, the next time they see you, they're going to kiss you on both cheeks. That can be very disconcerting if sort of you are not from a culture where that is normal, or I don't know if you've had that experience where you're like, okay, we're going in for that. Okay, we're doing that thing now. And then I never know, is it going to be one side, or are we doing three? Different people do different ones, and it throws me off. And it's also just personal things. So I come from a really affectionate family. So in our family, basically you go to the kitchen to get a snack. When you come back, people are like, hey, right? And there's hugging and there's all that kind of stuff. And then there are people who do not come from that background, and they'll be very disconcerted if there's sort of this affectionate kind of greeting kind of thing about what's okay, what's not okay. So thinking about that. So kind of the prompt that would be interesting to people to do is sort of think about, if you said aggressive, and some of this is basically doing the work that the emotional thesaurus has done, but sort of thinking about that, like what kind of things would tell a reader that someone was feeling aggressive? So things like they're frowning, they're pursing their lips, they're glaring, they're clenching their fists, they have a red face, they're invading personal space. Like those would be all things, instead of wanting to say, Mary Ann felt aggressive about what Kathy had just suggested. We could have, Marianne glared at Kathy through the, TCA screen. Give us your best glare, Marianne. There you go. She pulled a frown in there for you too, Kathy. Right? So we kind of have that. And again, it allows you to show, which we're always talking about. So you're showing the reader versus, Marianne felt aggressive. That's telling me what's going on. So it's a way of kind of showing that kind of thing. So I will put, when I put the office hours up, is, just a couple words and thinking about how you could show that on the page. Like if someone is very attentive or interested, what are they doing? Are they, holding still while someone's talking? Again, as a counselor, are they leaning forward? Those are things that we're looking at. And part of this comes, as people know, like I come from a counseling background. And that was one of the biggest things that we were trained to look at, was how someone would respond. So you would ask a question like, Natasha, what was the relationship like with your mother? And I'm interested. When someone does that, I'm like, interesting, right? And it's almost more interesting to me than whatever she's going to say. If she's crossing her arms, if she looks down, if she starts picking at her fingernails madly, it's like, even if she says, I had a great relationship with my mom. I really, really, we always got along really, really great. I'm going like, no, you didn't. Something there is not connecting with what you're saying. Sometimes it's also what's not said. So again, I say to Natasha, what's your relationship with your mom? And if Natasha says, my mom is so well respected in the community, like people just think the world of her. That's really interesting to me, because you're telling me what other people think of your mom and not actually answering the question I asked, which is, what is your relationship with your mom? So as a counselor, you're trained to kind of listen for, did people not answer the question that I asked? Did they hijack that conversation? Did they answer it, but their verbals don't necessarily match with their nonverbals? And is there something I should be taking away from that? And I'm a huge believer that readers love that, because for them, that engages them in the story. And I believe to some extent, all stories are mysteries, because we're trying to figure out how and why people do the things that they do. So give them a clue that they can start following, right? So if we have, Natasha, how do you feel about her mom? Natasha, lean back. My mom's a pillar in the community. The reader is going like, I believe I've seen something here, right? And whether or not it comes out in that scene, later I'm going to be like, oh, there was another clue, because I saw her avoid a phone call. Her mom called, she saw it was her mom and she didn't pick up. There's another clue to the relationship to the mom. And even though this isn't a mystery, though maybe it is, maybe Natasha killed off a parent, right? Like that's a possibility. But I'm piecing together those things, versus if you tell me I felt this way or the character felt this way, you're just putting it out there. So a couple things Janine actually put, like if she's seeing felt in a manuscript, that's a really good place to maybe go back and do a little bit of work or shifting around. I am going to put a call out. You don't have to take every felt out. Like sometimes people worry that they can never tell, that they always have to show. And so they're always trying to do that. Sometimes just tell, like just move the story forward. But it is a good place to kind of go back. And I think, Scott's comment in the chat window is also really valid, which is for most of us, early drafts are all about telling, because we're just trying to figure out what the story is. And then it's later that we're going back to try and fill those things in and kind of add those things to it. And again, for me, adding emotion and those kind of details are always a later version for me. It's not something that comes back. And Bonnie, you come, you go, you're so fickle.
Our internet is bouncing around. I don't know. Sorry.
I'm like, she's gone, she's here, she's not. So I am going to put some things in for people to think about. If you don't want to do it yourself, then certainly the emotional thesaurus, that's all what that book is about, is the idea of you can look up emotions and sort of get some ideas of how they show themselves on the page. But I think it's actually an interesting thing for yourself to reflect on, like even before you open that, like how does that show up? Because it's also different for different people. So if we talk about rage, I'm not certain about if for people in here, if you've had the experience where for some people rage shows up as like a table flipping, screaming, veins throbbing. For other people, it's getting icy, icy cold. And like in my family, that was completely that, like if you saw my parents, my dad would be the one who would be like, his head would be all red and he would be like, what did you do to the car? Blah, right? And there would be yelling, right? And my mom, like what you had to worry about if she would be like, there's something we need to talk about. And it would be this very calm, but like Marianne got the look that I think I would always get, like, oh. And if your middle name was used, Eileen Elizabeth, you need to come down here. It was like, I'm dead. Like I might as well just go out the window.
My mother had a particular tone of voice, and she'd say, because I'd be in a different part of the house, and she'd say, Marianne, can you come here, please? And then I'd think, not coming. I don't know what you want to talk about, but I'm not coming.
One of my most vivid memories of high school was I had asked to go, I was dating a boy at the time who was in a band, and he was playing at a local restaurant bar, and I had wanted to go, and my dad had said I could not go. So I snuck out to go anyway. And what I didn't know is that my mom had then talked him into letting me go with certain parameters. So she had come down to my room to tell me that I could go, and I had already flown the coop. And what ended up happening is several hours later, I was crawling back through the window. My bedroom was completely dark. My mom was sitting on my bed, which I did not know. And as I had one leg in the window, and I was kind of doing the thing where you're ducking all the way in, and I heard my mom's voice in this total dark room saying, do you need a hand? And I was just like, I am dead. Like, I just knew, like, but she was really calm. Whereas my dad would have been the one who would have gotten into the car, driven to the bar, and then dragged me out of there while, basically humiliating it. Like, they were just very different in how that anger showed up. So it's not just thinking about how anger shows itself, but how does your character deal with anger? Anyone else here, when you're lividly angry, start crying? That's a particular common one for women.
Yep, that's me.
Yeah, and it's because women have a challenge with that.
I actually I was brought up with a British accent, and if I am so furious that I'm trying to control myself, I will actually come out with a British accent, and I can't do it. It's just like, to me, it's just the coldest way of speaking I could possibly,
I'm just picturing like your kids being like, Mom's gone all Downton Abbey and shit. Like, we're in trouble. And if you start sounding like Downton Abbey, it's time to run. And I am also can be a swearer when I'm really angry. But I used to be a crier. Like I've kind of developed myself out of that. It was because being angry was not an okay thing for women in our family. And so I would just bottle that all up, and it would just show up where I would start crying. And where I had to get out of that was actually in work environments, because that's, you know what I mean? Like, you can be angry with someone at work, and we would have debates or whatever, like, because I did a lot of medical legal work. And so you had to be strong and willing to have that argument, but I would start crying. And that's, you don't want to cry on the stand. That doesn't look good. Natasha, do you want to just talk like real briefly about what you're getting from One Stop from writers, just because?
Oh, well, I just joined like a day or two ago because I had bought the Emotional Wound Thesaurus digitally, and I just recently discovered that if you actually open it up digital on Kindle on your computer, you can take notes and highlight stuff and do bookmark, and it's just brilliant for reference stuff, and I didn't know that. And then I started, I wanted to download one of the worksheets, and then I had to do so I ended up subscribing. And it is absolutely fantastic, like for just all the type of person, the emotions that you're that my character might experience, and what behaviors that might be exhibited by that emotion. If she's this type of person, what type of character would be a counterpoint and cause frustration? And I'm just sort of starting, I feel like I'm just at the tip of the iceberg. It is such a wealth of information.
And all of those books are on there. Like that's
Yes.
also why people are doing the subscription. So if you have
Yes.
the emotional thesaurus, or you have the emotional wounds, or they have one coming out on careers, like if you have a subscription, you can kind of just dive and dip into
Yes.
any of those.
I've been using it for a couple of months now.
Yeah.
And I still feel like I'm at the tip of the iceberg because there's so much, but all of the thesauri are in there, not just the emotional one, everything.
Yes.
Even some that aren't available as books, there's extra ones in there. But in the, they've got other stuff in the stacks. So tools for templates and worksheets for story maps, scene maps, world building, all kinds of stuff. And there's more stuff coming. So there's 2 interviews in the, that are, that's where I started. And
I will put, when I put this posting up and have kind of the summary, I will put a link to Angela's 2 interviews, because she actually talks about what's in this. And so it kind of gives you an idea. And there's also a coupon code attached. So if you are interested in getting it, you can get a little bit.
Yeah, she does a good job of summarizing all the tools and the ways you can use them in those interviews. It's worth starting there.
Yeah.
Or going back and doing it again in case you're overwhelmed and forget.
That would never happen. Not to me. No, certainly not. And I'm now concerned because Bonnie's apparently a silent rager who's plotting revenge. But yeah, I think it's interesting. You know, Lisa talked about people going in kind of 2 directions. Like when you're angry, you're either wanting to strike out or you're wanting to smooth things over, like make that you want to submit and want those things to go. So I think there are, you know, some instinctive ways, and really spending some time thinking not just how you respond, but how your character responds. And as Marianne just sort of mentioned, like if you have people that respond in different ways, those are going to potentially cause conflict and headbutting, and Bonnie threw her hands up in glee because she knows there's nothing I like better than a little bit of extra conflict. All right. So that was a whole lot of stuff, and we're running out of time. So I want to, believe it or not, an hour just flew by. So I want to thank everybody for that. If people have pages they'd like us to ever look at, we can always do blue pencils. Or if there's a particular topic that you'd like to drill down onto, then we can always do that. Just let me know what that is, and I will set it up for an upcoming office hour. All right. So everyone have a wonderful day. Do all the things, write all the words. All right.
Oh, I have a quick question.
Sure.